Hi, my name is Mikkel, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use UiPath and JavaScript to complete the RPA challenge. For those of you who don't know, the RPA challenge is a website made for testing your ability to do web automation with RPA tools. And whenever I'm learning a new RPA tool, I always use this website to test how well I know how to use the tool. The reason why the RPA challenge is good for testing your web automation capabilities is because the UI elements move around after every submit, and the name and ID attributes of your tags are dynamic, which means you can't use the normal selectors to find the inputs that you would like to find. The reason why I'm incorporating JavaScript into this video is because it is by far the most efficient way to complete the challenge that I have found. And if you can complete the challenge using JavaScript, you can usually use the same methods in other RPA tools. In this video, I'll assume that you know the basics of how UiPath works. If not, there are a lot of videos out there going in depth with how to use UiPath and how to complete the RPA challenge using UiPath. The primary focus of this video is to show you how to use JavaScript and UiPath combined to complete the RPA challenge. I will very broadly explain how HTML and JavaScript works for our purposes, but I highly recommend looking into some of the videos that are out there online explaining how HTML and JavaScript works. I have added a link to the website in the description below, and I have also added timestamps so you can easily jump to the information. To demonstrate why JavaScript is so efficient, I have prepared two flows in UiPath. One that uses the dynamic selector function that UiPath have. This is the way I originally completed the challenge, and I imagine this is how most people complete the challenge when they start using UiPath. The other workflow I've prepared uses the invoke JavaScript activity in UiPath to complete the challenge. Let's run the first flow and see how long it takes. As you can see, it took the robot about 57 seconds to complete the flow, which is quite fast, but now let us run the flow that uses JavaScript and see how long it takes to complete the challenge. As you can see, it took the robot less than a second to run the second flow, which is a lot faster than the first flow. Next, I'll go into how this works and how I have built the flow. Before we can talk about using JavaScript, we need to understand how websites are built. In broad terms, all websites are made using HTML. You can think of HTML as a house. You have different rooms and floors, and then you put things into these rooms on the different floors. If this made you more confused, let me show you an example. In this simple file I've made, you can see that I have a heading, two paragraphs, an input field, and a button. So, as you can see, every element on the page has what's called a tag, basically. So we can see here it starts with h1, which are wrapped in these, and it ends here with /h1. And this is my heading, and h1 is heading size 1. And we have the p here for paragraph, and another paragraph here. So the first one is going to say this is a paragraph, And the next one is going to say this is another paragraph. We have an input field here, and as you can see, it doesn't really wrap around anything, but we've put in a placeholder to say this is an input. So the input field will say this is an input in the input field. And at the end here, we have a button that just says this is a button. If I open this file using my browser, you can see that it looks like this. And here we can see the heading, the two paragraphs, the input field, and the button. There are a lot more tags in HTML, but for now the important part is that different tags are used for different parts of a website, and that the order they are written in is also relevant. Now, moving on to JavaScript. If you imagined HTML as your house, I think we can explain JavaScript as the movers you hired. You tell them what goes in the different rooms and on what floors. To do this, JavaScript uses selectors, and this might sound familiar to you since UiPath uses selectors to do web automation. For example, I can tell JavaScript, hey, could you please find the heading and then change it to this instead? Just like I can tell the movers to please take my old couch from my living room and put in the new couch. And then JavaScript can do this for me. Now, that's well and good as long as there's only one heading, but what if I want to update the text of one of the paragraphs in my file? How does JavaScript know which paragraph to change? This is where we can start to use what's called attributes. Some of the most common are ID and name. As you can see within my tags of my HTML file, some of these attributes are written for each tag. Using these, I could tell JavaScript to change the text for the element with ID number 1, or the element with the name paragraph 1. If we look at JavaScript as the movers, I can tell them to put the couch in room 1, or I could tell them to put it in the living room. If I want to try this out, I can go to my web browser and enter what's called the developer mode by pressing F12. In developer mode, I can see the HTML of the web page. Furthermore, I can use the inspect function and select an element on the website. You can see that if I do this and click my heading, it shows me the heading in the HTML. And if I find my heading in the HTML, it highlights it on the website. If I click here, I can find the console, and this is where I can write my JavaScript. Now let's see how I can use JavaScript to find paragraph 1. In the console, I write the following code. This code tells JavaScript to go find the element in the HTML document that has the attribute ID with a value of 2. And if I hover here, you can see that it highlights my paragraph on the page. Now that I can use JavaScript to select my paragraph, I can also use JavaScript to change my paragraph. In the console, I'll write the same code that I did before, but I'll also add something to it so it looks like this. What this does is locate the element, and then the .innerHTML part allows me to change the text for that element. Now, this .innerHTML method is a bit more complex than this, but for now this is what we need to know. I can do the same thing for my input field. However, the code looks a bit different. First of all, I need to use another ID. And second of all, I need to use the .value method at the end instead. As you can see in this example right here. When I run this code, it changes the value in the input field to what I input in my formula. And I'm sure by now, some of you might start to see how this might be useful for completing the RPA challenge. Now let's take a look at the developer mode on the RPA challenge website. As you can see, it has a lot more HTML than my file did, but do not despair. We can use the inspector tool to help us locate the different elements that we need. So if I use the inspector tool and click this input field, we can see the HTML for it right here. Now you might notice something that's a bit odd. The name and the ID does not really make a lot of sense. That's because these attributes are dynamic, which means that if I refresh the page, they're going to change. Now that's a problem. How will I tell JavaScript to identify the correct input field? And this is the part where normally UiPath takes care of this for you by using its dynamic selectors to automatically try anchor functions, etc. to locate the correct input field. Now, I don't want to do that. I want to just use JavaScript. And in this case, we need to use another method that I haven't shown you yet. This method is called querySelector, and it allows me to specify selectors that I want to identify an element. If we go to w3schools.com, we can find a list of what is called CSS selectors. This is because CSS is some code used with HTML to change the style of how HTML looks, and it uses these selectors. Now, I can also use these CSS selectors in the query selector method from JavaScript. And if I look here, I can see that I can actually select an element by specifying an attribute and what the value of that attribute must be. So the getElementById method only let me use the ID attribute as my selector. The query selector method lets me use whatever attribute I want. And if I want to, I can even specify a specific element that I want to look up. So for example, I can say I want an input field, and this input field must have a specific attribute with a specific value. Now, let's see how I can use this. If I go back to the RPA challenge website, I can see all the attributes for the first name input field when I inspect it. And I notice it has an attribute called ngReflectInName with the value label first name. So now I can write this code. And when I run it, you can see it updates the value in the first name input field to John. This is because there is only one input field on the page that has the attribute ngReflectName with the value label first name. If there were other inputs with the same attribute and value, this would not work. And I would have to find more selectors to make sure I only identify the input field that I want. Now, if I look at the other input fields, they also have the ngReflectName attribute. However, the value is different. For example, for the last name input field, the value is label last name. And for the other fields, this is also true. So now I can actually write 7 lines of JavaScript code to input data in all the fields for me, as you can see here. Now, if I add another line of code at the start, I can use JavaScript to click the start button before it inputs the data in the input fields. This makes the script look like this. So, as you can see, my script now clicks the start button and fills in the values for me. If I add another line of code at the end of my script, I can tell JavaScript to click the submit button after inputting the data. This makes my code look like this. As you can see, JavaScript executes my commands faster than we can see on the screen. And now if I write roughly 60 lines of code, I can make it click start, input the data for one form, and then click submit. Then input the data for the next form and click submit again. And it will repeat this until it's done with the 10 forms it has to complete. And as you can see here, it takes less than 1/10 of a second. Now, this is great, but I don't want to manually write the values in my JavaScript, because if I have to manually write the values, I might as well just fill out the forms myself. And this is where UiPath comes in handy. I've opened my flow in UiPath, and as you can see, I start by loading the data from the Excel file as usual, and then I loop through each row of data. However, this time, instead of using UiPath to input the data on the website, I use UiPath to input the correct values in my script for me, and then run that script on the website. This way, it does not matter if I have 10 or 10,000 forms to fill. UiPath will take care of that for me. To make this work for me, I use the activity called inject.js. With this activity, I can either write the entire script in the activity, or I can actually link to a JavaScript file on my computer, which is useful as I prefer to write code using an IDE, which is a text editor specifically for writing code. In this case, I have placed a JavaScript file in my project folder in UiPath. And if I look at the documentation online, I see that this action needs my script to be written like this. First, I make what's called an anonymous function by writing function. Then I write in the arguments of the functions in the parentheses behind it. I have to write the element part However, I'm unsure what this does in this instance. And I also have to supply it with another argument, which I have called input. Normally, I would make a parameter for each input field. However, when I tried to do that, I could not get it to work in UiPath. So instead, I turned the current row that I'm looping over into one long string, where each value is separated by a comma. Then in my JavaScript, I turn that string into a list of strings and refer to that list for the different values that I need to input. So as you can see here in my inject JavaScript activity, if I click on the input parameter field and open the advanced editor, you can see that I have my row first name that I turn into string, then I append with a comma, then I append with row last name value to string and append with a comma. And I do that for all the values so that when I put it into my JavaScript, it will be one long line, which is just comma separated. And then within my JavaScript, I turn that into my different parameters that I reference in the script. So when I run this robot, it will do the following. Read the data from the Excel sheet, then open a browser directly on the rpachallenge.com, and then loop through each row of data in the data table that we have created. And it will do so using our input parameters, which basically turns each row into one long comma-separated string. And the JavaScript will then turn that comma-separated string into a list of strings, which it can refer in the JavaScript. And then it will input all the data, and we will be done. And so, as you saw in the beginning of this video, when I run this robot, it completes the challenge in less than a second. Now, I know that in this video I glanced over the capabilities of HTML and JavaScript. But if you want to know more about these subjects, there are some really great tutorials online, and I do recommend getting more familiar with HTML and JavaScript if you are going to do web automation. I think almost all HTML tutorials will tell you about W3 schools, which is where we found the CSS selectors. It has a lot of documentation regarding HTML and JavaScript, and a bunch of other languages for web development. A link to the CSS selectors can be found in the description below this video. I hope you found this video useful, and if you have any questions or any comments, please let me know in the comment section down below.